All right, hello and welcome. And we're just going to get started on our flower chart. This is considered a advanced beginner kit only because some of these stitches would be learned in like a level 1 stitch sampler kit. And then this is where we're going to apply them. So some of the techniques you're using are something that you, if you've never learned before, may be slightly difficult if it's their first time stitching. But for a beginner, these would be just more advanced because you're actually applying them. So if you are a first time stitcher, that does not mean this is not going to be suitable for you. So don't be alarmed by that concept. We're going to teach you everything you need to know as a beginner. So the first thing we're going to do, if you have the kit, you're going to have a pre-printed fabric, your needle, your pre-cut thread, and you're going to have your instructions. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our fabric and we're going to get it into our hoop because that's our first step. If you have bought the PDF, you're going to need to do the transferring portion of this pattern. So you need to transfer your design to your fabric. So you might want to jump over, do that, and then come back to us. It'll be in your digital file. So our first step, because ours is already transferred, which is one of the benefits of this kit, is to actually get our fabric into our hoop and just centering it along there. And I like to, so we're going to take our inner hoop, which is the closed portion of this hoop, and our outer hoop, we're going to loosen our screw a little bit so that it slides over top of this really nicely. I'm just going to make sure that I have my fabric exactly where I want it. Takes a little bit of finicking sometimes because we can kind of fiddle with it once it's in there, but it's easier to get it roughly in the spot we want it. That'll do. You can always change it after too. All right, so as I close this, I'm going to tighten it a little bit, and then I'm going to pull my fabric around the edges and just kind of get it tight in there and the fabric laying like flat. You'll notice that you'll get some bubbles, and then I'll tighten it a little bit more. It'll probably create some more bubbles, and I'll keep pulling as I get that fabric in there. I like to pull more from the sides on this kit just because of the lettering. If you're pulling from the bottoms, it can kind of warp your text a little bit, but obviously we need to pull everywhere. And then I'm getting that top screw really tight. I'm not tightening it completely before I pull just because you want to pull, tighten, and just keep going around until you kind of get it really nice and tight. You want to hear sort of that drum sound. You want it to really sound like you're playing the drums. That's the key to keeping the tension, and it'll be a big part of your success as a beginner stitcher. One of the biggest mistakes people make is that their fabric isn't tight in here, and then they end up with all this slack, which makes it difficult to stitch. So this is a pre-printed fabric. So the fabric is quite a heavy cotton twill, and I really like this one for the pre-printed for this specific pattern. I use two different kinds. I use 100% cotton and then this cotton twill. And for this one, because it is such a like intricate design, I liked the heavier fabric. It gives it a little bit more weight. And then the idea for this one was that I liked the idea of potentially being able to hang this in a frame with this fabric, and the heavier weight would be a little bit nicer for that. So that was my intention, to give you guys that option. So now that we've got it in the hoop, got it nice and tight, one recommendation that I'll say is to have a little screwdriver handy. You can give it, I've tightened that as much as I possibly can with my fingers, but if I give it a few turns, I can actually turn it quite a bit with a screwdriver that I couldn't with my hand. So a screwdriver is always helpful. And then we should be ready to stitch. So you've got your supplies. Your needle comes in this prepackaged little kit. Depending on the kit type you have, you may have a kit, the beginner box, which comes with this. So you might have a lot more options for needles. We are just going to use the size 24 tapestry needle. It will work for all of the stitches. If you have the big needle pack and you've done one of our strands kits, you can choose to use a different needle or something else, but that is the one that will come with the essentials kit. And then all of your thread in the Essentials kit will be pre-cut for you. Again, if you got a bigger, more deluxe box, you're gonna have all the full skeins. If you do have a full skein of the thread, you know that you're gonna be pulling from the numbered end of your skein, always pulling from that end. And we're always pulling about an arm's length of thread unless we're working with 12 strands. So in part of your kit with your pre-cut thread, you're gonna find that for 2 of your roses, you're gonna have an extra long piece of floss in both this red shade, your light pink, and as well your hot pink. So basically all of your pinks and reds, you're gonna have an extra long piece of thread. That's the thread that you're gonna be working with the woven wheels. So just as we get to those parts, make sure that you're using the longer strand for the woven wheels. It's made so that you can double it up, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So your thread is pre-cut for you. You will need to split your strands yourself. So when we get started, I will start with splitting strands and explain a little bit of that. The few concepts that you need to learn as a beginner before getting started is going to be splitting your strands, threading your needle, knots, and different stuff like that. So this is going to be your beginner section. We're going to start with taking the thread. Obviously, we just talked about coming from your skein. So I'm going to start with the first shade I'm going to be using for this kit, which is 26 in the light purple. And I'm going to pull at arm's length of thread. Again, like I mentioned, if you are doing this kit and you have the pre-cut floss, you will already have these cut to an arm's length. So when we get our floss, it comes with 6 strands. So these 6 strands are twisted up. And if we pull the end of our thread, it kind of divides, it separates the strands into kind of like pulls them apart a little bit more naturally. And as we can see, like these 3 are slightly more separated from the other 3. So actually pulling them in a more natural way makes it easier to twist them. If I start to see the bottom twisting like that, I will pull it straightened out, and then I just continue along the bottom, straightening that out as I go. And I sometimes just guide my finger along it, just helps to separate it. And then I take my 2 sections and put one aside, and I'll thread one set. So we're going to get our needle out. One of the biggest mistakes that beginners do make is that they take too much thread. So this being pre-cut to an arm's length, that's a good amount of thread to work with. If you are finding that it's knotting up quite a bit on you, you can do something called doubling up your floss, or if you're just finding that you're losing the thread on your needle more often than you'd like. So typically when we thread a needle, we'll leave like a little tail hanging here. I typically pinch my needle as I stitch to prevent it from pulling out of the eye of the needle. And then we would just knot the end of our thread. But if you are a beginner and you're finding that you're losing the thread on your needle, you're having to rethread your needle quite a bit, one option is to take your 2 ends and actually tie them together. And what this does though, is this is what we'll be using for the 12 strands. This creates the doubled up effect. So what essentially will happen here with 3 strands is you'll now be stitching with 6 strands. Now, for most of these stitches, you're going to be using 3 strands to stitch it. If you need to stitch doubled up, I would suggest going to 4 strands for anything that it says 6 strands on. I wouldn't suggest, anything that it says 3 strands on. So I wouldn't suggest going to 6 strands. I would suggest threading 2 strands and then folding that over and going to 3. I also wouldn't suggest going down to 2 because stitching with 2 strands takes quite a bit longer. So for this pattern, if you feel like you need to double up your thread, I would recommend stitching with 4 by doubling up 2. Otherwise, we'll just stitch with our tail hanging down here. And a suggestion is just to pinch the needle as you're stitching. And then the next thing we need to do is we need to tie a little knot in the end of our thread. You can either do a quilter's knot, which is, I'll show that after, First, the most simple is just to do a loop, push your thread through the loop and pull a knot. Just a simple knot. I just slide it down as close to the end as I can get it, trim the end, and we're done and ready to stitch. If you would like to do a quilter's knot, which is just a different version of creating a knot, you have take your threaded needle, and you're going to put it horizontal to your thread, and then take your thread over top. I like to put my finger on top of the thread, on top of my needle, so they're kind of like coming at each other from the other angle. Sorry, just get the focus for you. And then I wrap it around my needle, maybe 3 times. I keep my tail over here so that it's not, so it's on the other side of where my working thread is, and then push up and pull your knot through, which creates a knot, trim your end, and you're ready to go. So either of these works. Again, if you're doing the doubled up, which we will always do with 12 strands, with 12 strands, you're gonna thread 6 strands and then fold it over, which doubles it up. You'll just put your ends together and do the flip. And I don't think you could do a quilter's knot. I mean, I guess maybe you could. Never done a quilter's knot with 12 strands. So, okay. So then we've got our needle threaded. And then the last thing I'll show you is how you would finish a stitch. So here's one of my practice ones. I'm just going to quickly show you as if I had stitched through here. I'm going to do a little stitch over top. Okay, and then, so I am ready to tie off my thread. I'm gonna come to the back of my pattern where my thread is at the back, and I'm actually just going to push my needle underneath some of my already finished work. I'm gonna guide it underneath and loop it around my already finished stitches. An extra protection would be if you wanna thread your needle through the loop, which creates kind of like a knot. I would say you really only need to do that 2 times. So weave it underneath the other stitches 2 times before you're done, and then trim it up. There's not a lot of pressure on these projects, so you don't have to knot it too many times. You're not putting a lot of strain on it. So just create my knot one more time. Okay. And then we have learn to split our strands. Obviously threading our needle, I didn't go over too in depth, so we can talk a little bit about that if you still need some guidance. These needles are designed with quite a wide eye, so they shouldn't be too difficult to thread. Some small tips would be making sure that you're working with a nice blunt end, so just giving it a trim before you thread it. I always wet my thread, give it a little pinch so that it's nice and flat. I pinch it between my 2 fingers, and then I take my needle with my large eye up to my thread while it's pinched, and I kind of guide it in through, and then it threads so easily. 3 strands is a really easy one to thread with these wide tapestry needles. The tapestry needle, which is what's included in the basic kit, it should come in any box that you're getting, even if you've gotten the deluxe box. The reason that I stitch with these, I always stitch with these when I'm using 12 strands, 6 strands, just because threading 6 strands through an eye of an embroidery needle is quite difficult, whereas threading it through a tapestry needle isn't the easiest, but it's not, it's normally like a 1 try situation. They have quite a wider eye, so they are so much simpler to thread. And when we're working with a pattern that varies in the amount of stitches, the amount of strands that we're using, I find the tapestry needle is a quite middle of the road. It's got a really wide eye, so it works great for 12 strands. But it also is thick, but not too thick. When you go to a size 1 embroidery needle, which might have a wide enough eye to thread 6 strands, it's going to be a very thick needle. Whereas a tapestry needle is about the width of a size 5 embroidery needle, which is a really great needle for anywhere from 3 to 6 strands. It's kind of that middle of the road needle. So that's how I feel about the size 24 tapestry needle. It's the same diameter as a size 5 embroidery needle, which is considered one of the most universal. So it just has a larger eye. It is a little bit shorter, so I find some people like a longer needle, which embroidery needles are, but it also has a dull tip, which I really like because it's sharp enough to stitch through the fabrics that we use, but not so sharp that when I'm trying to grab my needle at the back and I poke myself, it doesn't hurt. Okay, so that's a little bit about needles, which is just the basics. If you want to learn more about needles, I do have a kit called the Strands and Needles Stitch Sampler Kit, which goes into lots of in-depth information about strands and needles. but we won't talk too much about that here. The next thing is that you're going to be ready to stitch. So once you're ready to stitch, I will meet you back. We're going to start with our lilac, and we're going to start with 3 strands of the DMC 26, or you can go to DMC 31. We're just going to be starting on these little flowers, and I'll give you a few examples. And I will see you back there, ready to stitch.